Welcome back, guys, to Wrong Turn Horror. In this episode, I'm sharing 10 disturbing Christmas night stories that still can't be explained. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so YouTube shows you stories like this next time. Also, let us know from where you are watching and what time it is there. On the night of December 24th, 2017, in a small town on the outskirts of Lake Superior, where the winter storms came down with relentless force and the streets were coated in layers of ice that made every step a calculated risk, 20-6-year-old paramedic Rachel Turner had been called to a routine check on an elderly woman living alone in a secluded cabin miles from the nearest neighbor. And although it seemed like a quiet, ordinary assignment, the air that evening carried a weight unlike anything Rachel had felt before. Suffocating cold that pressed against her lungs and made the headlights of her truck shimmer in the storm like they were underwater. And as she navigated the snow-draped road, the wind howled through the pines like voices whispering warnings she could not understand. When Rachel finally arrived at the cabin, the surrounding woods were silent, except for the crunch of her boots in the snow and the occasional snap of a distant branch. But the house itself seemed wrong, the lights inside flickering faintly despite the old woman insisting she hadn't touched the switches all day. And when Rachel stepped onto the porch, she noticed the front door was slightly ajar, a thin strip of darkness cutting through the warm yellow glow of the entryway, and a chill ran down her spine as she reached for the handle, realizing instinctively that someone or something was inside that shouldn't be. Pushing the door open slowly, she called out a greeting, "Mrs. Caldwell." "It's Rachel, from the paramedics." But the only response was a faint shuffle from the living room. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, revealing the room in disarray. Chairs overturned, a broken lamp on the floor, the Christmas tree standing but leaning dangerously, ornaments cracked and scattered, and a thin layer of frost clinging to the window panes as if the cold outside had been dragged inside, suffocating the warmth. She took a cautious step forward, and that's when she saw a shadow flickering across the far wall. Tall, thin, moving with impossible slowness, and a low, guttural hum that didn't belong to any human escaped the dark corner behind the staircase. Rachel's pulse spiked as she called out again, "Hello? Is someone here?" And the hum ceased abruptly, replaced by soft footsteps echoing across the wooden floorboards. Deliberate, methodical, moving toward her. She grabbed the small flashlight from her pocket, sweeping its beam across the room, and froze. A figure standing by the fireplace, face obscured by a thick scarf and hood, long black coat fluttering as though it had been made from shadows themselves, eyes glinting faintly in the light, and in its hand a small, jagged knife catching the reflection of the tree lights. Rachel's instincts screamed for her to retreat, but the cabin felt constricting, trapping her in a world where the snowstorm outside no longer mattered because the real danger was here. Inside, moving closer, silent except for the soft scuff of boots against the frost-covered floor. She tried to back away toward the door, but it slammed shut on its own. A violent bang that rattled the walls and made her ears ring, and when she reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge, as if the very frame of the house had frozen around it. Panic surged, and she ran to the nearest room, pushing open the bathroom door, only to see a figure in the mirror standing behind her, the same hooded intruder, and when she spun around, no one was there yet. The room felt impossibly colder, frost forming along the edges of the tiles, her breath visible even in the dim light, and then a whisper low and jagged, crawled across her ears. "You came alone." She froze, realizing the voice was familiar in tone, yet twisted, hollowed, a mimicry of something human. And the intruder stepped into view at the doorway, sliding silently across the threshold, movements fluid but wrong, limbs bending at angles that should have been impossible, and Rachel raised her flashlight shakily, the beam flickering as though unsure whether to illuminate reality or some nightmare realm. The figure paused, tilting its head, and a cold, inhuman grin spread beneath the hood, and then it moved again, slow, deliberate, approaching the Christmas tree where the ornaments rattled without wind, the lights flickering like a heartbeat, and Rachel realized with sudden horror that every shadow in the room had lengthened, stretched unnaturally, following the intruder's movements, as if the very air of the cabin had been warped. She backed toward the bedroom where the old woman's bed sat, covered in a thin sheet, and the intruder's whisper followed her, "You'll stay." The words resonated in her chest, vibrating, freezing her from the inside out, and when she reached the door, it swung open violently of its own accord, as though the house itself had become a puppet under the intruder's command. She stumbled outside, snow crunching under her boots, but the storm had intensified, snow whipping horizontally, visibility near zero, and when she looked back at the cabin, the lights inside flickered once before going completely dark, leaving only the silhouette of the intruder in the doorway, impossibly tall, standing like a sentinel, watching, waiting. Rachel ran blindly through the woods, branches clawing at her coat and face, snow blinding her. But the sounds followed, whispers, scraping, the soft padding of boots that didn't crunch snow but seemed to hover just above it, moving parallel to her steps, always one step behind, always following. And when she dared to stop to catch her breath, the whispers coalesced into a single chilling phrase, repeated over and over, "Join us. Celebrate with us." She stumbled onto the frozen lake at the edge of the property, thinking the open ice would give her escape. But the wind carried the intruder's voice across the expanse, magnified, and she realized the whispers were not coming from the figure alone. They were coming from all around, echoing off the frozen trees, off the snow, as if the storm itself were alive with their chorus. Every instinct screamed to run, yet her limbs were numb, her eyes watering from the cold, and when she fell to her knees, frost cracking along her boots and gloves, she saw dozens of faint, elongated footprints radiating outward across the lake, leading nowhere, disappearing as if swallowed by the snow. And the whispers crescendoed, now a deafening hum inside her skull, and the shadowy figure appeared at the far edge, lantern in hand, ice forming along the edges, flickering in unnatural blues and whites. Rachel screamed, trying to turn, but the cold seemed to cling to her skin, freezing her movements, and she could see now that the figure's face was human enough to recognize the intruder as one of the town's missing over the past decade, yet twisted, frostbitten. Their mouth frozen in a silent scream, eyes hollow, begging, and the figure raised the knife slowly, pointing it toward her chest. And the whispers coalesced into a single chilling sentence. "This is your last Christmas." She felt the wind press against her, as if it were a living thing, icy fingers brushing her hair and cheeks, and when she tried to scream again, only a frozen rasp escaped her throat, cutting off instantly. And then the intruder stepped forward, touching her shoulder with an icy hand, and all at once the whispers became thousands of voices, singing, chanting, calling, dragging her into the snow, into the storm, into darkness, and when the first responders found her, hours later, wandering near the highway, frostbitten and incoherent, she claimed the intruder had returned every year to the same cabin, each time following someone new, each time whispering the same chilling promise, and despite extensive searches, the cabin appeared empty, no footprints, no damage, no sign of anyone having entered, only the faintest trace of frost along the windows and the echo of voices in the wind. And every Christmas Eve since, locals claimed to hear faint footsteps, a scraping on doors, whispers in the trees, and lantern lights flickering in abandoned windows, as though the Yule night intruder waits patiently, selecting the next victim for a holiday that never ends. On the night of December 23, 2016, in the remote backroads of northern Maine, where the forests pressed in on either side of the highway like dark walls, and the snow had fallen for days in endless, suffocating layers, 28-year-old Nathan Grayson, a local radio technician, found himself driving a narrow route he had taken hundreds of times before to inspect a series of emergency communication towers that serviced the area. But this Christmas Eve, the highway was eerily deserted, the snowstorm thick enough that his headlights barely illuminated the first 20 feet of road, and as he climbed the icy incline toward the highest tower, his car began to shake violently, the tires slipping on a thin layer of black ice that glimmered faintly under the cold moonlight. And for the first time all night, Nathan noticed a figure standing motionless at the edge of the tree line, illuminated only by the weak glow of his headlights. The figure was tall, thin, hunched slightly forward, wearing layers of tattered winter clothing that fluttered in the wind as though frozen in motion, and the face was obscured by a scarf and hood. But the way the person or thing stood, unmoving despite the storm, made Nathan's stomach tighten with unease. He considered turning round, but professional pride and curiosity compelled him to continue, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the radio in his truck began to emit a strange, low-frequency static, humming at a pitch that vibrated through his chest. Though all the other frequencies were turned off, all the other channels dead. Then, suddenly, a faint voice crackled through the static, barely audible over the howl of the wind. "Help. Please, help." Nathan froze, leaning closer to the receiver, heart pounding, because he recognized the voice. It was his younger brother's. Matthew, who had died tragically in a car accident 2 years prior, the memory of which still haunted him every holiday season, and the voice repeated, "Help. It's cold. Don't leave me." Compelling, pleading, chilling him to the bone. And for a moment he thought it might be a cruel prank, but the voice's tone was so familiar, so filled with fear, that he could not dismiss it. As he approached the first tower, he noticed the footprints in the snow leading directly from the forest to the base of the tower. They were human, yes, but elongated and uneven, as though someone or something had walked on frozen stilts, leaving impressions too distorted to belong to a living person. And Nathan's breath came in rapid bursts as he grabbed his flashlight and exited the truck, the cold biting through his coat and gloves, teeth chattering violently. He moved toward the footprints, shining the light across the pristine snow, and the deeper he went, the colder the air became, the wind dropping in pitch until it was almost silent, leaving a suffocating, unnatural stillness. And then he saw it. The tower itself was intact, yet the surrounding ground seemed warped, snow-piled unnaturally. footprints spiraling in circles as though some unseen entity had danced around the structure, waiting, watching. As Nathan reached the base, the radio's static rose in volume, and suddenly a loud signal beeped, cutting through the storm, a repeating pattern like Morse code. But when he tried to tune it in, it became distorted, layering his brother's voice with dozens of others' childish cries. Adult whispers, shouts for help, overlapping in a ghastly, chaotic symphony, and the longer he listened, the more the sound seemed to seep into the ground itself, vibrating through his boots and teeth, freezing him from the inside out. Panic surged, and Nathan stumbled backward, slipping on the ice and almost falling into a shallow ravine, only to catch himself as the radio emitted a sudden, piercing shriek that made him drop his flashlight, which rolled across the snow, illuminating briefly a figure moving within the tower's shadows. It was Matthew, or rather, a twisted imitation of him, pale and frostbitten, limbs jerky and awkward, eyes hollow, face frozen into an expression of perpetual terror. And as Nathan backed away, the figure lifted a hand, pointing directly at him, and whispered again, "Join us. Stay with us." The air grew denser, frost forming rapidly on his coat and hair, his fingers stiffening with ice, yet he could hear more voices rising from the radio, calling his name, beckoning, pleading, a chorus of lost souls trapped in the signal. Nathan ran back toward the truck, but the snow seemed alive now, gripping his boots, slowing his escape as the tower's shadow stretched impossibly across the ground, elongating, twisting, as if reaching out with invisible hands, dragging him back. And when he finally reached the door, the truck's engine refused to turn, lights flickering, gauges going haywire, and then the door handle rattled violently from the inside, even though he had locked it. A low, groaning sound rose from beneath the chassis, metal bending like flesh, and Nathan realized with mounting horror that the footprints had multiplied, surrounding the truck in a perfect circle, the snow disturbed as though something had walked round and around him while he tried to work the ignition. He pounded on the steering wheel, screaming, begging for any kind of escape. But the wind had picked up again, carrying the overlapping voices across the frozen landscape. And in a split second, the hood of the truck cracked open violently on its own, ice-covered hands emerging from beneath, wrapping around the engine, lifting it, wrenching metal as though it were paper. And the lights of the tower flickered, revealing dozens of frostbitten faces pressed against the metal lattice, mouths frozen open, eyes empty yet staring, all whispering, chanting, calling him closer. Nathan tried to run, but the snow was now up to his knees, the cold so intense that he felt his skin hardening, his veins freezing, and as he looked back, the figures moved with unnatural speed, gliding, sliding across the snow, converging toward him, the radio's signal becoming unbearable, a high-pitched wail that split the night and made his ears bleed. He fell forward, landing on his hands, snow packed into his palms, and as he scrambled to stand, one of the figures reached him, grabbing his wrist with an icy grip, fingers curling round bone-like steel, pulling him toward the tower. And Nathan felt a force like gravity itself increasing around the structure, drawing him forward as if the entire earth was bending. Desperately, he clawed at the snow, trying to free himself, but every movement was slower, heavier, colder, and as he neared the tower, he could see now that the figures weren't simply frostbitten humans, they were elongated, twisted, something between frozen corpses and spectral entities, mouths moving, whispering names, chanting for him to join, eyes hollow yet burning. And as the tallest figure extended its arm, Nathan recognized the face for one terrifying second, his brother Matthew, his frozen lips moving, eyes wide and pleading. And then the world went silent. The next morning, the local authorities found the truck abandoned. Engine cold, tires buried in fresh snow, footprints leading into the surrounding woods ending abruptly, as though whoever had walked there had vanished, and the radio inside the cab was dead. Cracked beyond recognition, but it emitted one final, distorted message when technicians later examined the memory, a repeating loop of voices, Matthew's among them, whispering, "Stay. Forever. Join the signal." Locals say that every Christmas Eve since, the tower picks up a strange signal on the old emergency frequency, almost inaudible, voices calling out names of anyone who ventures near, and those who have listened report feeling icy hands on their shoulders, breathing frost into their necks, and seeing shadowy figures drifting through the woods, waiting for the next snowbound traveler to answer the call. On the evening of December 24th, 2015, in a remote part of northern Michigan, where snow had fallen for weeks and the highways were little more than slick white ribbons stretching into the dark woods, 29-year-old Laura Jensen was driving alone on her way to her sister's cabin for a small family Christmas gathering when she noticed a figure standing by the side of the road, barely visible through the thick curtain of falling snow. And at first she assumed it was a stranded traveler, a common enough occurrence during the holiday season. But as she slowed the car and rolled down the window, she realized something about the stranger was off. The person wore an overcoat several sizes too large, hood pulled low over a face that was pale beyond normal, almost blue, and the fingers that emerged from frayed gloves were thin, rigid, and tipped with what appeared to be ice instead of fingernails. And when Laura offered to stop and help, the stranger simply stared with black, unblinking eyes, their gaze cold enough to burn through the windshield, and whispered in a voice that cracked like frozen wood, "I need a ride," before slowly raising one hand to point down the road ahead. Something in Laura's gut screamed at her to drive on, to ignore the strange figure, but compassion, guilt, and the holiday spirit made her pull over, sliding the door open and gesturing for the stranger to enter. And the moment they were inside, the warmth of the car seemed to falter as if the stranger carried the winter with them, an unnatural cold that crept along the seats and air vents. And when Laura tried to speak, the stranger tilted their head slightly and whispered again, "We're almost there," though Laura had no idea where there could possibly be. And as she drove on, the landscape outside seemed to grow darker, the snow heavier, trees bending over the road like skeletal arms reaching down, and for the first time, she noticed the car thermometer reading negative 23 degrees, despite the car's heater blasting at full. And when she glanced at the stranger again, the eyes had shifted, glowing faintly in the dim dashboard light, black onyx-like pupils surrounded by frost, and a faint mist escaping the thin, cracked lips each time they exhaled. Hours seemed to pass without any sense of time, and the road became less familiar, twisting into paths she had never seen, lined with deep snowbanks and abandoned cabins that looked as if they had been untouched for decades, their windows frosted over and doors hanging crooked. And every few minutes the stranger would whisper again, their voice almost a chant, almost until Laura realized that the words were growing louder, more insistent, echoing in the car as if the vehicle itself were amplifying them, and the radio static began to crackle violently, playing distorted Christmas music overlaid with faint whispers that sounded like children, laughing or crying, she couldn't tell which. And then the car lights flickered, revealing the figure in the passenger seat had turned their head toward her in a way no human neck could, snapping with an audible crack, the face tilting at a perfect 90-degree angle, staring directly at her with eyes that seemed to pierce her soul. And at that moment Laura slammed on the brakes as the road ended abruptly at the edge of a frozen lake that hadn't appeared on any map she knew. The water beneath the ice, black as ink, reflecting the pale moonlight and the frozen forest beyond. The stranger slid out of the car with unnatural speed, landing on the snow without a sound, and beckoned her with a hand that glowed faintly with frost, ice forming along the edges of their glove as if reality itself were freezing at their touch. And Laura, heart hammering, realized she couldn't move, couldn't speak, paralyzed by a fear older than reason, as the stranger began walking across the lake, leaving no footprints, their form blending into the pale moonlight, the ice beneath their feet cracking faintly but never shattering. Driven by instinct she didn't understand, Laura followed, stepping onto the lake, only to feel the ice grip her boots as if trying to hold her back. The cold now so intense that she could see her veins turning blue beneath her skin, and with every step, the stranger's voice echoed in her mind, chanting in words she couldn't comprehend, yet somehow understood. Come closer. Come closer. It's warmer on the other side. Panic surged, and she tried to turn back, but the shore she had left was now shrouded in mist, invisible, and the only thing she could see was the pale glow of the stranger's lantern hovering above the ice like a frozen star. Suddenly, the ice cracked under her weight, splintering in jagged lines across the black surface, and the temperature seemed to plummet even further, each breath tearing at her lungs. And the stranger paused, turning to look at her again, the slightest hint of a smile on their frozen lips, and whispered, "Don't be afraid. You'll sleep soon." Laura screamed and tried to retreat, but her boots slipped on the slick ice, sending her sprawling forward, and as she hit the surface, she realized it was no longer solid. The ice had given way beneath her, plunging her into the freezing water below, the world going black as she struggled for air, her limbs numb and weak. And the last thing she felt was the stranger's icy hand brushing her shoulder, lifting her gently, dragging her silently across the lake as if she weighed nothing at all. Hours or maybe minutes later, she woke to find herself lying on the snow-covered shore of the same lake, alone, body trembling violently, clothes frozen stiff with ice, frost covering her hair and eyelashes. But the strangest thing was that the footprints she had made in the snow were gone, replaced instead by dozens of small, perfectly formed footprints that didn't belong to any human, leading from the trees to the water and back again. And at the edge of the frozen lake, a small lantern glowed faintly, casting a pale, cold light across the snow, and when she bent down to pick it up, the flame extinguished immediately, and in its place, a whisper tickled her ear. Next year. Same time, same lake. Laura ran without looking back through the forest, until she reached the highway hours later, where a passing trucker saw her shaking violently, frost forming on her eyelashes, and called emergency services. But when authorities returned with her the next morning to investigate, the lake was perfectly frozen, the snow undisturbed, and no footprints of any kind led to or from the shore except one set of tiny, elongated footprints disappearing into the frozen woods, the kind that had a shape to wrong, too stretched, too unnatural to belong to any human being. And ever since that night, every Christmas Eve when the wind howls through northern Michigan, residents claim they can hear soft whispers drifting across frozen lakes, faint footsteps cracking ice, and the sound of a lantern flickering somewhere beyond the tree line, as though the frostbitten stranger is still out there, waiting patiently for the next traveler foolish enough to stop for a hand, a smile, or a ride. It was the coldest Christmas in Vermont in nearly 60 years. The kind of winter that made every breath sting and every window rattle as if the wind itself were trying to break inside. And for 27-year-old Mia Hollander, the holiday was supposed to be quiet. Just a simple trip to her family's secluded cabin to pack up old belongings after her parents passed away last spring. But from the moment she stepped out of her Jeep and heard the deep groan of the surrounding pines leaning under the weight of the snow, she felt something was wrong. Something subtly watching, something waiting. And the sense only grew stronger when she unlocked the cabin and found the temperature inside far colder than it should have been, as if the place had been holding its breath for months. The first unsettling moment came quickly. She flicked the lights on, and they sputtered violently before bathing the living room in a dim yellow glow, revealing that the Christmas decorations she remembered boxing up with her father years ago were somehow back on display. The small ceramic reindeer on the mantel, the red and green embroidered throw on the couch, even the old wooden advent calendar her mother loved, all laid out exactly as she remembered them from childhood, except she hadn't put any of them there. A chill deeper than the cold ran through her because she knew no one had keys to this cabin except her. And the nearest neighbor lived 14 miles down a single-lane road already buried by the storm rolling in. She tried to brush it off, convincing herself maybe she had forgotten the decorations last year. Maybe grief had blurred her memory, but the longer she stayed, the more the house felt occupied. Late that evening, after unpacking and lighting the fireplace, she heard a knock at the front door, gentle but firm, deliberate, too loud for someone simply seeking help. And when she froze in place, heart pounding, she heard it again. 3 slow knocks. She peered out the window but saw only swirling snow and the faint outline of the empty woods. And when she opened the door a crack, letting icy wind pour in, no one stood there. Only fresh footprints leading away from the porch and stopping abruptly at the tree line, as if whoever or whatever made them dissolved into the forest. She shut the door and locked every deadbolt, but an uneasy dread twisted in her stomach, growing sharper each time the house shifted or the wind scraped branches against the roof, sounding eerily like fingernails dragging across wood. By midnight, the knocking returned, but this time from the back door, then the side entrance, then the windows, moving around the cabin in a slow, circling pattern that felt almost playful, as though something were testing her, teasing her, studying her reactions. She grabbed her phone, only to find it had no signal, no surprise that deep in the mountains, but when she turned on airplane mode and off again, the screen flashed for a split second, revealing an unread voicemail from an unknown number, time-stamped just minutes earlier. When she pressed play, expecting silence or static, she heard her father's voice broken, shaking, whispering her name, followed by a low, ragged breathing that didn't sound human. And then, right before the voicemail cut out, her dad's voice whispered, "Don't let it inside. It remembers you." For a moment, She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't even cry. She just stared at the phone, trembling, knowing her father had died months ago and that the voicemail was impossible, yet undeniably his voice. The knocking continued, growing bolder, louder, until suddenly it stopped entirely, leaving the cabin in a silence so complete it pressed against her ear. And that silence was somehow worse than the knocking. She sat by the fire, gripping the poker like a weapon, staring at the door and windows, waiting for movement. But instead, something else happened. The house lights flickered. The fire dimmed, and for a heartbeat, she saw a reflection in the glass. A tall, hunched figure standing behind her in the hallway, its silhouette distorted, wrong. Its limbs too long and head slightly tilted, as if studying her like prey. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. Yet she could swear the air still carried that feeling of being watched, the hair-raising awareness of presence. Desperate, she turned on every light, even the old Christmas ones stored in the attic, hoping brightness would chase away the fear. But when she plugged them in, instead of glowing with warm holiday cheer, they flickered with a sickly bluish hue, pulsating like a heartbeat. And the moment they lit, a new sound echoed through the cabin's low, heavy footsteps moving across the roof. She held her breath, listening as the steps moved from one corner to the other, pacing, dragging, as if the thing was deciding where to come down. Snow fell from the ceiling beams as the weight above pressed down, making the wood creak loudly, and Mia backed away until she reached the wall, whispering to herself that it couldn't be real, that she was imagining it. But when a long, dragging scrape traveled along the roof, inch by inch, like claws etching through ice, she knew imagining wasn't an option anymore. The footsteps stopped directly above the living room, and the cabin fell silent until something spoke. It wasn't loud, but a soft whisper drifting down through the chimney, a voice that sounded almost like her mother's, calling her name in a lullaby-like tone her mother used when Mia was a child. Except there was something hollow, hungry in the cadence, as though the creature were mimicking the voice rather than remembering it. Mia covered her ears and screamed for it to stop, and for a moment it did. Then the entire chimney rattled violently, soot cascading down, and a long pale arm shot out from the fireplace, followed by a second arm, both impossibly thin, bending at unnatural angles as they groped the floor, searching, reaching. Mia bolted for the bedroom, slamming the door behind her and pushing a dresser against it. But almost instantly the door began to shake as that thing dragged its twisted limbs down the hallway, nails scraping the wooden floor like shards of ice. The power went out, plunging the cabin into darkness, leaving only the sound of the creature sniffing the air on the other side of the door, inhaling her fear like a scent trail. She grabbed her father's old hunting rifle from under the bed, though she wasn't even sure if it was loaded, and aimed it at the door as the knob slowly began to turn. The thin crack between the door and frame widened, and a single eye peered through, not human, not animal, but snow-white with no pupil, reflecting her own terror back at her. She fired without thinking, the blast shaking the room, and the creature let out a shrill, distorted shriek that rattled the cabin walls, retreating just long enough for her to shove open the window and climb out into the snow. She ran barefoot into the storm, gasping from the cold, leaving a trail of blood from the glass that sliced her ankle, but she didn't care. She only knew she had to get away. She sprinted toward the tree line, snow blinding her vision, but she didn't stop until she heard it again, the knocking this time coming from the trees themselves. Dozens of knocks echoing through the forest, as if the woods were alive and calling her name. When she looked back through the swirling snow, she saw the creature standing in the doorway of the cabin, tall and skeletal, its limbs dangling, its head tilted the same way her father used to tilt it when waiting for her to speak. And as it took a step toward her, she heard her mother's voice, again but clearer, closer, whispering, "Mia, come back home." She ran until she collapsed, and when rescuers found her the next morning, half frozen and unconscious near the highway, she babbled about voices, footsteps, a thing on the roof, but no one believed her. Police investigated the cabin, but found no footprints, no damage, no signs of forced entry, nothing except a single voicemail, left on Mia's phone while she was in the hospital. Her father's voice once again, whispering, "You shouldn't have run." And every Christmas since, no matter where she moves, Mia receives the same voicemail on Christmas Eve, always from an unknown number, always with her father's voice whispering those same 3 words, followed by the slow, deliberate sound of knocking. If you want Story 7, 2,000 words, single paragraph, just say yes, you said. Story 7 in paragraph form for 2,000 words. ChatGPT said, "Here is Story 7. Written exactly as you requested. One long, uninterrupted paragraph. Around 2,000 words. Dark, Christmas horror narration. Winter atmosphere, emotional dread, realistic tone inspired by true style events. Story 7, Silent Caroller on Birchwood Lane. One continuous paragraph on the night of December 22nd, 2013. The cold in northern Minnesota was so brutal it felt like the sky itself had frozen, trapping every sound beneath a suffocating blanket of frost. And 34-year-old Evan Wilkins had just returned to his childhood home on Birchwood Lane after years of avoiding it, hoping the Christmas season might soften the memories he'd been running from. But nothing about the place felt warm anymore. Not the streets lined with old-fashioned wreaths, not the cheerful porch lights of neighbors, not even the freshly fallen snow that lay untouched like a white burial shroud across the entire neighborhood. On Christmas Eve of 2013, in the remote Wyoming town of Elk Ridge, where the mountains swallowed the sky and the snowstorms came down like white avalanches of silence, 30-2-year-old paramedic Jonah Hale discovered a truth the town had whispered about for decades, a truth buried under winter, buried in police files, buried in frightened memories that parents refused to share with their children. And it began at 11:46 p.m. when he received the final emergency call of the night from a location that should have been impossible, a place no one had lived in for nearly 25 years, the old Blackburn cabin deep in the northern woods, a cabin abandoned since Christmas Eve 1988. The night the Blackburn family vanished without a trace during a killer blizzard. Jonah had grown up hearing rumors of the Blackburn night, stories of faint screams carried on the wind, stories of figures seen wandering between the trees with lanterns that glowed the wrong color, stories of something in the woods that didn't freeze, didn't die, didn't leave footprints. As a child, he thought they were just tales told to keep kids from wandering too far into the forest, but now, the emergency dispatcher's trembling voice was clear. "Jonah, we got a 911 call." From the Blackburn landline, Jonah stared at the radio in disbelief. The cabin had no electricity, no power lines, no working equipment. Yet something had placed a call, whispering a single word before the line cut: "Help." Jonah hesitated for barely a moment before putting on his gear. He was a paramedic. He didn't get to choose which calls were real and which were nightmares. He drove the ambulance as far as the snowed-in road allowed, then grabbed a medical bag and a flashlight and continued on foot, boots sinking into the deep drifts, breath clouding the air like smoke as he pushed deeper into the tree line. The woods felt wrong the deeper he went, silent in a way winter woods shouldn't be. Number wind, no animals, no cracking branches, only the sound of snow settling under his feet. His flashlight beam struggled through the falling snow, illuminating the skeletal branches of pines bending under the weight of ice. And then, after nearly 30 minutes, he saw it, the Blackburn cabin, half buried in snow, its roof sagging, its porch rotting, windows blacked out from decades of frost. The place looked untouched, frozen in time, like the night the family disappeared had been trapped inside it like an insect in amber. Jonah's breath wavered. He approached slowly, his boots creaking on the steps. The front door, still painted the same faded red from old photos, stood slightly open, moving gently with the faintest movement of the storm. Jonah pushed it wider, his flashlight slicing through the darkness, revealing a living room coated in frost, furniture overturned, a Christmas tree still standing in the far corner, its ornaments cracked and faded, its garland drooping like a dead vine. He whispered, "Elk Ridge, Em's Call, out if you can hear me," but the only response was the settling of old wood. The air inside was colder than the storm outside, unnaturally cold. His breath fogged instantly, drifting like smoke toward the staircase. He noticed something, then on the far wall, carved into the wood, were deep scratches, long and violent, as though someone had clawed at it with broken fingers. Jonah's pulse quickened. He stepped deeper inside. That was when he heard it, the faintest sound, coming from upstairs. A voice, a child's voice. "Hello," Jonah called out, but the voice didn't answer. It whispered again, only slightly louder, a girl's voice, this time, "Daddy." Jonah shuddered. The Blackburns had a daughter, 7-year-old Emily, who disappeared with her parents on that same Christmas night. Jonah's flashlight trembled in his grip as he stepped onto the staircase, each step groaning under his weight. Halfway up, the air grew colder, as though he was stepping into a freezer. The girl's voice whispered again, "Daddy, please." It's dark. Jonah reached the top floor, the hallway stretching before him with 3 doors, 1 open, 2 closed. The open door led to a small bedroom, covered in dust, with a broken lamp lying on the floor. He entered slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the room until the beam stopped on a small figure sitting on the bed. A child, a little girl, her knees pulled to her chest. Jonah exhaled, relieved and terrified at the same time. "Hey," he whispered gently, "I'm here to help. Are you hurt?" The girl didn't move. Jonah stepped closer and froze. Her hair was stiff, coated with frost. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. Her clothes were those of the late 80s, worn, outdated, tattered from decades. Her lips were blue. She looked dead, but her eyes were open, staring straight ahead, unblinking. Jonah's body tightened with dread. The girl whispered, "My daddy said he'll be back." Jonah swallowed, every instinct screaming to leave. "Emily," he whispered. The girl's head turned with an unnatural slowness, cracking sound coming from her neck as if frozen joints were breaking apart. She looked at him with hollow, frost-filled eyes. Jonah stepped back. Her voice came out wrong now, lurid, echoing too deep for a child. he never came back. Jonah turned to run, but as he backed into the hallway, he saw something that froze his blood. The two closed doors were now open, and in each doorway stood a figure, a man and a woman, the parents, or what had once been the parents. Their bodies were stiff, limbs bent unnaturally, faces white with frostburn. Their mouths hung open as if frozen mid-scream. Emily slid off the bed without bending her knees, her feet dragging across the wooden floor with a sickening scrape. Jonah stumbled backward, heart pounding against his ribs. The father figure stepped forward, its voice cracking like ice breaking on a lake. We waited for help. The mother's jaw unhinged slightly, frost dripping as she whispered. We called and called. Jonah backed toward the stairs, but the father moved faster than something frozen should move, jerking forward with a sudden twitch. Standing only a foot from Jonah now, breath forming clouds of frost in the air. Jonah raised his flashlight, shining it into the father's face, revealing sunken eyes, blackened fingertips, and a throat torn open as though clawed from the inside. The father whispered, "Do you hear the wind?" Jonah's hands shook violently. I'm going to help you," he managed to stammer, but the mother cut him off, her voice rising in a chilling wail. "You're too late." Emily's voice layered over hers, and then another voice, and another, dozens of them echoing through the cabin as if the walls themselves were speaking. Too late. Too late. Jonah ran for the stairs. He didn't look back. He reached the bottom floor, but the front door slammed shut with a thunderous crack, the old wood splintering as frost spread across it instantly like a living thing. Jonah ran to the windows. They were coated in several inches of ice, impossible to break. The voices upstairs grew louder, descending the staircase with slow, heavy steps. "Help us, help us. Stay with us." Jonah bolted into the kitchen, searching for anything, a back door, a window, something, but every surface was coated in frost, every drawer frozen shut. The temperature continued to drop, so fast his breath became thick and heavy. And then, behind him, he heard a soft tapping. He turned. Emily stood in the kitchen doorway. Behind her, the shadows of her parents loomed unnaturally tall, stretching across the walls like dark, twisted silhouettes. Emily stepped forward, her bare feet leaving no footprints in the frost. "You came when no one else would." Jonah gripped the counter, legs shaking. I shouldn't be here." Emily shook her head slowly. "You heard us." Jonah felt the air shift, colder still. The parents moved closer. Every Christmas, the father rasped, "Someone hears us." The mother's voice dissolved into a whisper, "Someone comes." Emily raised her head, her eyes glowing faintly blue, "And someone stays." Jonah lunged for the back door, slamming his shoulder into it with all his strength, but the frost cracked and then reformed instantly, thicker than before. The lights flickered, then died completely, plunging the room into darkness. Jonah heard footsteps behind him, fast, unnatural. He spun around with a flashlight butt. The beam flickered weakly, on and off. In one flicker, he saw nothing. In the next, Emily was inches from his face, her skin cracking, her eyes empty. She whispered, "It's so cold here." Jonah screamed, stumbling backward. The flashlight dropped, rolling across the floor, illuminating the kitchen in rotating beams. In one beam, the father was suddenly at Jonah's left. In the next, the mother appeared at his right. Then, closer and closer. The cold spread up Jonah's limbs like he was being swallowed by ice. Emily whispered in his ear, "Stay with us." "Stay warm." But her breath was freezing. Jonah's knees buckled, his body going numb. He felt hands frozen, hands grasping his arms, his shoulders, his face. Dozens of fingers clamping down. He screamed again, but the sound died instantly as frost filled his throat. His vision blurred, the room fading, cracking, freezing at the edges. The last thing he saw was Emily's face, inches away, smiling with cracked lips. "Merry Christmas," she whispered. 3 days later, rescuers found the Blackburn cabinet, appearing unchanged from the outside but inside. They found something new, a fourth frozen figure in the kitchen, sitting upright at the table, covered in frost, eyes open wide in silent horror. Jonah Hale was never found alive, but every Christmas Eve, the Blackburn landline, disconnected for decades, still makes a single 911 call. And whoever answers hears the same word Jonah heard that night: help. On the night of December 26, 2004, one day after Christmas, when the small town of Redwood Hollow was blanketed in a suffocating silence from the worst blizzard the region had seen in 60 years, 30-year-old Marcus Langford learned that sometimes the most terrifying things don't happen on Christmas Eve. They come after, when the world has relaxed, when the lights are dimmed, when people believe the danger has passed. And when Marcus heard the first knock on his door at 2:13 a.m., deep into the frozen night, he knew instantly that it wasn't the wind or the storm or the usual creaking of his wooden cabin. It was deliberate, slow, and heavy, echoing through the foyer like a fist made of stone striking against hollow flesh. Marcus had been living in Redwood Hollow for only 7 months, trying to escape the noise and chaos of Los Angeles after a traumatic home invasion left him anxious, sleepless, and desperate for a quieter life. The mountains offered that peace until this night. Outside, the blizzard had turned the world into a swirling void of white, snow slamming against windows, strong enough to withstand winter but not fear. Marcus sat up on the couch where he'd fallen asleep watching static-filled Christmas reruns, his heart hammering as the knock came again, louder now, and he felt the cold creep down his spine with the same icy certainty that something was terribly wrong. He approached the door slowly, gripping the handle of a fire poker as he peered through the peephole, but saw nothing, only darkness, swirling snow, and the faint glow of his porch light cutting a weak cone in the storm. His breath fogged the wood as he whispered, "Who's there?" And for a moment there was no answer until a soft voice, fragile and trembling, drifted through the door. "Please, let me in, it's so cold." It was a child's voice. Marcus froze, confusion and dread intertwining. No children lived anywhere near his cabin. The closest family was 4 miles downhill, and no one would be walking in this storm. He didn't unlock the door. Instead, he said, "Where are your parents?" The voice trembled again, sounding wet, almost bubbling. "I lost them, please. Open the door." Marcus stepped back. Something was wrong with the voice. It sounded like a child. Yes, but there was a strange hollowness to it. Like the words were stretched, like the voice was repeating something it had memorized rather than speaking naturally. The knock came again, softer this time, but so slow, so deliberate it made Marcus's stomach twist. He checked the windows, but the snowstorm was too thick to see anything beyond the glass. He grabbed his phone, no signal. Power flickered, the lights dimming to a sickly yellow glow. The child's voice came again, now from closer to the bottom of the door, like the speaker was crouched low. It's freezing. I can't feel my fingers. Please. Marcus swallowed hard. He wanted to help. Every instinct told him to open the door, but something deeper, older, primal told him not to. Outside, the storm howled like a living creature. And then the voice whispered, I know you're alone. Marcus flinched. How could a lost child possibly know that? He backed away until he bumped into the hall table. He grabbed the flashlight and aimed it through the side window near the door, and what he saw almost made him scream. Just beyond the porch railing, half hidden by the snow, was a small figure about the size of a child, but its posture was slumped unnaturally. Its limbs stiff, its head tilted too far to the side. The flashlight beam flicked across it, tanned. In that brief second, Marcus saw pale skin coated in frost, lips blue, hair stiff with ice, and eyes that reflected the light with an animal-like shine. The figure flickered us, if the snow itself distorted it. Marcus backed away fast, breath shaking. The voice spoke again, but now it came from behind the front door, even though the figure he'd seen was out in the yard. Let me in. I'm so cold. Marcus felt nausea rise as realization crawled under his skin like spiders. Whatever was outside, whatever was speaking, was not a child. He turned off the flashlight, trying not to make a sound, but as soon as he did, the lights in the cabin flickered violently and then went out completely. Darkness swallowed the room. The wind howled louder. And then came a new sound, slow, dragging scrape along the porch, like something being pulled through ice. Marcus held his breath. The scraping reached the door, then stopped. Silence, utter, suffocating silence. Marcus felt the air shift. Something was at the door, inches from him. And then, impossibly, he heard breathing on the other side, harsh, ragged, wrong. Marcus stumbled backward into the living room, bumping into the Christmas tree, knocking ornaments onto the floor with soft, eerie jingles. He grabbed the fireplace poker with shaking hands and positioned himself in the darkest corner of the room, holding his breath, waiting. After a full minute, he heard steps, slow, soft steps, moving along the side of the cabin. Something was circling the house. Something small, something whispering. I'm cold. The whisper glided from one window to the next. Let me in. It slid across the frozen glass like a breath of fog. Let me in. Marcus crouched lower, gripping the poker so tightly his knuckles turned white. The storm outside intensified, pounding against the walls, rattling the roof, making the cabin groan. Then, every window in the house suddenly frosted over at once, an icy sheet crawling across the glass like a living organism. Marcus could see the frost thickening, forming shapes, teeny handprints. Dozens of them. He whispered to himself, this is not real. This is not real. But the hands smeared down the glass, long, dragging strokes, like cold fingers tracing their way inside. The whispering grew louder. You can help me. You can save me. Open the door. Marcus shut his eyes. The voice changed suddenly. Shifting in tone, it became deeper, older, layered, as if 100 voices were speaking at once through a single throat. Open the door. Marcus covered his ears, shaking violently. The walls buckled under the force of the wind. Snow blew through tiny cracks in the logs, swirling into the room in ghost-like trails. And then the cabin fell silent again. Marcus waited in the dark, trembling. The storm continued outside, but the whispers had stopped. No footsteps, no scraping, just wind. For a brief moment, he dared to hope it was over, until he heard the faintest sound, one that broke him. A soft thump from the roof, followed by another. Something was crawling across the top of the cabin. Marcus's blood ran cold. He looked up through the dark, imagining tiny frozen fingers gripping the shingles. A cold body dragging itself closer to the chimney. And then he heard it scratching. Inside the chimney, something was climbing down. Marcus ran to the kitchen, nearly slipping on fallen ornaments. He grabbed the biggest knife he owned and pressed his back against the counter just as ash began to fall from the fireplace. Then a hand, small, pale, lifeless, reached out of the chimney mouth. Marcus screamed and ran to the back door, wrenching it open without thinking. A blast of ice-cold wind slapped him as snow filled his lungs. He sprinted into the storm, wearing only socks and a thin t-shirt. But the terror in his veins burned hotter than the cold could numb. The trees blurred around him as he ran blindly through the snow, his breath ripping from his chest. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he had to get away from whatever had crawled into his home. He made it maybe 100 yards before he heard it again. The voice, but this time it wasn't behind him. It was ahead of him. Closer, it's so cold. Marcus stumbled backward as a figure emerged from the storm, a small body, hair frozen to its scalp, fingertips black with frostbite, eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The child-shaped thing moved toward him with jerky, twitching steps. "Help me." Marcus turned to run the other way and slammed into another figure, and another, and another. They appeared in the storm like ghosts, surrounding him. Children, a dozen of them. All frozen, all pale, all dead, and all whispering, "Let me in." Marcus collapsed to his knees, sobbing, his breath crystallizing instantly. One of the children stepped forward, tilting its head with unnatural slowness. "You left the door open," it whispered. Marcus shook his head violently, tears freezing on his face. "Please, please." The child leaned close, its icy breath brushing his ear. "Now we can come in." The last thing Marcus felt was hands, dozens of tiny, frozen hands, his legs, his throat, pulling him down into the snow as the storm swallowed his screams. When rescuers reached his cabin 3 days later, after the storm cleared, they found the front door open, snow piled waist deep inside, Christmas decorations scattered across the floor. There were footprints, small ones, leading inside. But there were no footprints leading out. Marcus Langford was never found. But every year, after Christmas, during the first big snowfall, residents of Redwood Hollow say they hear knocking on their doors late at night. A soft voice whispering through the cracks, "It's cold. Let me in." And if you look out the window at just the wrong moment, some swear you can see tiny frost-covered handprints slowly forming on the glass. The night of December 21st, 1998, still haunts every living resident of Silver Pines, Montana, but none more than 24-year-old Claire Donnelly, who was the only person to see what really happened the night the Christmas choir disappeared in the snowstorm. During their annual house-to-house caroling, she had been sitting alone on her cabin porch that evening, her breath forming ghosts in the freezing air as she waited for the choir to arrive, because they always stopped at her cabin, even though she lived at the edge of the forest, past where the houses ended and the tree line swallowed the last streetlight. But traditions were traditions, and the Silver Pines Choir had a rule. No home, no matter how isolated, should be left without a Christmas song. Claire was lonely that year, still grieving the sudden loss of her younger sister Lily in a tragic accident the previous spring. And the thought of hearing the familiar, cheerful voices outside her door gave her a rare spark of comfort. Snow had begun falling an hour earlier, soft and delicate at first. But now the storm was thickening into a white curtain that swallowed the road whole. And Claire wrapped her coat tighter around herself as the cold air settled like ice on her skin. Around 7:15 p.m., she finally saw the warm glow of lanterns approaching through the timberline. The soft silhouettes of the choir bundled in coats and scarves as they trudged through the rising drifts, their voices drifting faintly as though carried by an old gramophone rather than lungs. But something felt immediately wrong. Their footsteps were too synchronized, their heads held at the exact same angle, and their voices, usually joyful, loud, and imperfect, were coldly harmonious, every note sharpened to chilling precision. Claire stood slowly, heart beginning to pound, as the choir reached the edge of her yard and stopped in perfect unison. 12 members standing shoulder to shoulder in the snow, their lanterns glowing with a strange bluish tint instead of the warm yellow they always carried. Claire stepped forward and said hesitantly, "Evening. Are you all okay?" Expecting to see familiar faces, Mr. Hargrove with his thick moustache, the Johnson twin girls giggling to each other, old Mrs. Porter with her crooked hat butt. Instead, she saw nothing but pale skin and hollow, frost-rimmed eyes staring unblinking at her, faces she didn't recognize. The choir opened their mouths as one, and a low, vibrating note poured out that made Claire's bones ache. It wasn't singing, it was something deeper, older, like a hum coming from the earth beneath the snow. She stumbled back, gripping the porch railing, as the strange choir raised their lanterns, the blue light brightening until it illuminated their faces more clearly, and Claire's stomach twisted. Their cheeks were sunken, their lips slightly blue with frostbite, and on their eyebrows, lashes, and hair rested a dusting of ice crystals, as though they had been walking in the storm for days. One woman's scarf was frozen solid against her neck. A man's gloved fingers were stiff, bent unnaturally. And then Claire realized something: each member's feet were bare in the snow. Not boots, not shoes. Bare, bluish feet standing on ice without leaving footprints. Claire tried to speak, to shout, but her voice tangled in her throat, and as she backed toward her cabin door, the hum rose in pitch until it became a sharp, slicing harmony that made the windows vibrate. Suddenly, the storm intensified, snow whipping around the choir like a swirling white halo, and the tallest figure, the one in the center, stepped forward. Claire recognized him. It was Thomas Keller, the choir director who had died in a car accident on December 21st, 1987, exactly 11 years ago to the day. She had been a child then, but she remembered the tragedy clearly. His car had skidded off the icy road while the choir was being transported to their annual singing route, killing all 12 members. The town memorialized them every year with a candlelight vigil and a moment of silence. Now Thomas stood 10 feet from her porch, his face half frozen, his jaw moving stiffly as he whispered, "You didn't come to our vigil tonight, Claire." Claire steadied herself, breath shaking violently. "Thomas, this isn't real," she whispered, but his frostbitten lips curled into something like a smirk. "We walked so far to find you. You were always the one who listened." The wind wailed as if responding to his voice. Claire's mind raced. She knew she had forgotten the vigil, too overwhelmed by loneliness and grief to attend, And now the dead stood outside her home demanding acknowledgement. The choir began to sing again, a twisted version of Silent Night, their voices hollow and layered with an unnatural resonance, as though other voices, distant crying ones, joined in from somewhere deep beneath the snow-covered ground. Claire ran inside and locked the door, pushing a chair against it as the windows rattled violently. The voices outside grew louder, pressing against the cabin walls, vibrating through the floorboards, swirling inside her skull. Suddenly, all sounds stopped. Claire's breathing echoed in the silence. She crept toward the window, peered out, and her heart seized. The cabin was surrounded. The frozen choir members now circled the house completely, lanterns held high, faces turned toward her, eyes glowing faintly blue in the storm. The tallest figure spoke again, his voice drifting through the cracks in the wood like icy breath. "It's Christmas, Claire. You'll walk with us, won't you?" Claire stumbled backward, shaking uncontrollably. She grabbed her sister's old snow boots by the fireplace, clutching them as she whispered, "Lily, help me." That was when she heard her sister's voice, a soft, trembling, familiar voice humming from the hallway Lily's favorite Christmas lullaby. Claire froze, tears spilling from her eyes. Lily had died in March. The humming grew louder. Claire whispered, "No, no, no, you're not Lily." But the voice responded gently, "Come, see me, Claire." Against every instinct, Claire stepped toward the hallway, each movement slow and terrified. The light flickered, the humming stopped, and at the far end of the hall, standing in the faint glow of the kitchen lamp, was a small girl with blonde hair and a pink winter coat, Lily's coat. Claire's breath shattered into broken sobs. "Lily." The girl tilted her head, smiling the same warm smile Lily always had until it melted into something jagged and wrong. Her mouth stretching too wide, her eyes darkening into pits of swirling frost. The small figure whispered, "Come with us." Claire screamed and bolted toward the back door, wrenching it open as the storm roared inside. Snow blinded her as she ran into the woods, branches whipping her face, ice tearing at her lungs. The sound of footsteps, dozens of them following in perfect rhythm behind her. She didn't dare look back. The voices carried through the trees, singing that warped, monstrous hymn, closer and closer. Claire stumbled down a slope, crashing into the snow, and when she lifted her head, she saw them emerging from the darkness between the pines' 12th ghostly shapes, their lanterns glowing like cold stars. Thomas stepped forward, voice echoing strangely. "You should have come to the vigil, Claire. We remember those who remember us." She tried crawling backward, but the snow felt thicker, heavier, swallowing her arms. Her breath heaved into the freezing air as she whispered, "Please, just let me go." Thomas lowered his lantern, blue light spilling over her. "Join the choir," he murmured. "One song, one night. Walk with us, and we will leave you be." Claire shook her head violently. "No." His face darkened. "Then you will walk forever." The choir advanced. Claire screamed, scrambling to her feet, sprinting toward the distant glow of town lights. She could see them faintly through the storm, but the wind rose into a violent cyclone, pushing her back, lifting snow into swirling walls. The voices surrounded her, their harmony rising in a chilling crescendo. Suddenly, she tripped over something half buried in the snow, a frozen wooden sign. She wiped the frost with trembling fingers. It read, "Choir Memorial Trail, -1987. She had run directly into the route where they died. The air grew impossibly cold. Frost formed across her eyelashes. Thomas Keller's voice whispered behind her ear, "We never finished our song." Claire turned, heart exploding in terror, as a circle of lanterns closed in, bluish light painting the world in deathly color. She screamed until her voice cracked, but the snow swallowed every sound. The next morning, the storm cleared. Search teams found no footprints near Claire's cabin. Only a circle of perfectly untouched snow, as though no one had walked there in hours. Claire's cabin door was open, her coat still on the hook, the table still set for one. Her body was never found. But every year since, exactly on December 21st, residents of Silver Pines report hearing faint singing, drifting through the forest, the same distorted version of Silent Night. And some people swear they see a young woman among the ghostly figures carrying a lantern, her lips blue with frost, her voice blending perfectly with the dead choir as they walk the old memorial route, forever searching for the next soul to join their Christmas song. On the night before Christmas Eve, 11-year-old Nolan Pierce woke to the sound of footsteps crunching through the brittle snow outside his bedroom window, and when he peeked through the curtain, he saw a man standing motionless in the blizzard, tall, thin, wrapped in an old black winter coat with a long red scarf blowing violently in the freezing wind. Yet the man himself did not move, did not blink, did not show any sign of breath leaving his body. He only stared directly into Nolan's window with an expression that was almost curious, almost expectant, and when Nolan whispered for his mother, the man's lips pulled into a slow, unnatural smile before vanishing into the swirling snow, as though he had been swallowed by the storm itself. The Pierce family lived in a small, warm home in Concord, New Hampshire, a quiet street filled with glowing Christmas lights and inflatable decorations. Now half buried under the heaviest winter storm the state had seen in years. Nolan's mother, Emily, worked holiday shifts at the hospital, while his father, Kyle, a truck driver, was stuck on a route and wouldn't make it home until after Christmas. That first night, Emily dismissed Nolan's fear as nightmares caused by the storm. But when she checked the window, she found nothing outside, only an empty street and thick white fog rolling across the frozen yards, until Nolan pointed out the detail that changed everything: a faint, icy handprint on the inside of the glass. By morning, news stations reported 3 missing people across New England, all last seen during the storm, all described similarly: a tall man in a dark coat. A red scarf, details Emily tried to hide from Nolan as she turned off the TV when Christmas Eve arrived. The storm grew vicious, hammering the house with wind so strong it made the walls tremble. Emily and Nolan slept in the living room to stay warm near the fireplace as the power flickered repeatedly. Around 1:34 a.m., the house went completely dark, and only the weak glow of the dying fire illuminated the room. That was when they heard the knocking, slow, rhythmic tapping on the back kitchen door, each knock spaced apart as though whoever was on the other side knew exactly how to make their presence felt. Emily forced herself to investigate, flashlight shaking in her hand, but when she reached the door, the knocking stopped. Instead, she saw something far worse: wet footprints, human, adult-sized, inside the house, trailing across the hardwood floor and leading toward Nolan's room. Terrified, she locked every door, pushed furniture against the entrances, and remained awake until dawn, trembling and clutching Nolan in her arms. Christmas Day brought no relief. The storm thickened, The temperature dropped to deadly levels, and the emergency alerts warned citizens not to travel or go outside. That evening, as Emily sat anxiously by the window hoping Kyle's calls would come through, another alert flashed, one reporting a local winter legend seldom spoken of anymore. A figure known as the Winter Watcher, a tall man seen only during violent storms, known for standing silently outside homes, never speaking, never entering them, lest a child had called him. Emily dismissed it as folklore circulated by panicked residents, but her hands shook as she turned off the phone. Nolan, meanwhile, heard whispers outside the house, soft murmurs that drifted from window to window like someone circling the home, testing the walls. At 2:09 a.m., the porch light flickered before dying, and suddenly the house was plunged into an unnatural stillness. The doorknob twisted gently. Light tapping followed. Then, unmistakably, a man's voice whispered from the other side of the door. "Nolan, I've been waiting." Emily dragged Nolan closer to the fireplace as the house temperature plummeted below freezing, and she shouted, "How do you know his name?" Silence followed, just for a heartbeat, before the same chilling voice responded. "Because he called me." That was when Nolan remembered the ritual he'd performed with 2 classmates a month earlier. A stupid internet challenge, summoning a winter guardian by speaking a series of phrases intended to call a protective spirit. A ritual he'd laughed off as nonsense. Except now, the memory of whispering into the cold air, "Watcher of winter, come find me," returned with horrifying clarity. Before Emily could question him, a thunderous crack shattered the front window, and a pale, long-fingered hand reached through a web of broken glass, sliding a small folded paper onto the floor before withdrawing. The note contained a message in delicate, old-fashioned handwriting. "I will come on Christmas night to take what called me," accompanied by a crude drawing of Nolan holding hands with the man in the red scarf. Panic surged as Emily desperately tried to call police, but the lines were down. She scrambled to barricade the house again while Nolan trembled near the fire. Hours later, at 3 a.m. sharp, the storm abruptly stopped, not softened, but stopped entirely, as though the sky itself was holding its breath. The temperature inside the home plunged even further, ice forming along the walls, when suddenly footsteps echoed from the hallway. Emily froze. These footsteps were inside the house, coming from Nolan's bedroom. Emily armed herself with the fire poker and stepped in front of Nolan just as a tall silhouette appeared in the hallway entrance, unmoving, half shadow and half moonlight, the red scarf lying perfectly still across his chest, the darkness of his eyes hollow and inhuman. When Emily swung the fire poker, it passed through him like smoke, as though he wasn't fully part of this world. He turned his head, studying her, then walked through her body like a cold gust of air, sending her collapsing to the floor, gasping as frost formed on her clothing. Nolan screamed, grabbing a burning log from the fireplace and waving it wildly. The flames didn't hurt the Watcher, but they slowed him, making his movements flicker like a glitching shadow. Nolan dragged his mother toward the back door, kicking it open as snow blasted into the room. The storm had returned suddenly, roaring with supernatural fury. When the Watcher appeared behind them, Nolan realized something. He could not cross the threshold into the storm. He was bound to the house, trapped inside. The figure stared at Nolan with dark understanding, whispering, "For now," before fading away as the house's power suddenly surged back, lights flickering to life and heat returning as though nothing had happened. Emily survived with hypothermia. Police arrived and found footprints outside the house, but none inside, dismissing the event as weather-induced hallucination, though one officer turned pale when Nolan described the red-scarfed man, muttering that a similar figure had been reported during storms in the 90s and even the 60s. After that night, Nolan never saw the Watcher directly again, but every Christmas Eve, a neatly folded red scarf appeared on their porch, bone-dry despite falling snow, which Emily always burned immediately. Yet the smoke drifted into the shape of a tall figure watching from the corner of the room. And last Christmas, for the first time since the nightmare, Nolan found a letter in their mailbox with no stamp or return address, only his name written in thin, elegant handwriting. Inside, the message was brief. One day, the storm will open again, and when it does, you will walk with me. No drawing this time, just a small, icy handprint pressed inside. And far away, deep in the winter woods, someone in a red scarf waited patiently for the next storm.